Megami is a forgotten character. I think that when you look at what has happened in Jujutsu Kaisen as of late in the manga, compared to where we actually are now in the anime, it becomes quite obvious that there is a large disparity with a great majority of characters, but Megami definitely tops out the list. And I think the simplest way to put that is he's kind of forgotten at this point. And there's a couple different reasons for that, and there's a couple different ways this could be rectified, and there's a couple different ways that this arguably would have been better if it had gone. So let's go ahead and break all of those down. Now, if you have by some means managed to avoid spoilers for what is the second most popular manga in the world right now, I congratulate you. I also warn you, this is where we're going to get into some spoiler territory, so if you're anime only, you probably want to wait to watch this. But if you're good to go, let's go. So, when it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen and its approaching the end era, because of course all the shonen mangas are ending now for some reason and we don't have a lot to replace them, we've kind of found ourselves in an interesting spot where a vast majority of the characters that we know and love just aren't present anymore. Some are dead, but then some others have actually just kind of faded into the background, seemingly not to be used. And some people are anxiously awaiting that these characters are going to get their turn, but the problem with saying a character is going to get their turn is that it implies that it's almost like a chess match, which arguably most fights in a manga shouldn't be. And no fight in Jujutsu Kaisen has ever felt that way. So, as we're dragging out the ending of this series now, waiting for certain events to happen that we can only hope will happen because Gege is hardly the most predictable mangaka and has done several things to upset the audience, one of the biggest is, will we ever get Megumi back? A lot of people are riding on the fact that we will because they think he might participate in the final battle, and they also think there's going to be a big scene with Shoko explaining to him what happened to his dad. That's not the greatest evidence in the world, though, because originally the greatest hope that everyone had that Gojo was going to get out of the prison realm was that he was going to explain to Megumi what happened to his dad. And we are far, far flung from the time when that was actually a viable reason to consider why Gojo and Megumi would come back. So it becomes quite obvious that Megumi is kind of forgotten. Despite the fact he's technically present, Sukuna is now a character who has pretty much, for lack of a better term, eaten him. And he's just completely overcome this character now. And that's kind of a shame because where he is now and where he could have gone are really interesting factors. The other thing you have to consider is that he was billed as the deuteragonist. He was essentially the pick any side character in any anime that you can immediately think of. Bakugo, Zoro, Sasuke, he was any of these to the main character. Although, maybe in Jujutsu Kaisen, it's easier to say that he was another main character. Jujutsu Kaisen never quite had the same feeling of some other manga, where they entirely seemed to focus on one character, therefore Megumi's arc and journey was just as important as Yuji's or Nobara's. The big issue with that is that when he disappears now, it just leaves whatever felt like was the progress of his story is gone. Is completely cut off. That might have been the point, but it sucks because there was a lot of emotional investment for a lot of fans in that. And even if he were to be brought back, I don't think he'll be around for long. Whether that means he would die in the next battle, which is possible, or more than likely the next battle just won't actually be that long because Jujutsu Kaisen fights aren't usually long with the exception of the Gojo fight. So, as a character who is supposed to be essentially our second runner-up, he's just kind of vanished. Now, let's talk about where he was and where he was going. Now, when I say his current standing, I'm going to break that down into two parts. The part that was actually Megumi, and then the part that is Sukuna. Because the two are unfortunately inexplicably linked, and there's a couple different reasons for that. For one thing, the last time we actually saw Megumi, not Sukuna, but Megumi, he had come pretty far in taming multiple animals with the Ten Shadows technique. He had gotten the vast majority of them. I think he had 4 left to go, including Maharaga. And because of that, he had a pretty extensive library of moves at his disposal. In addition to that, he had started to grow even more powerful with his domain expansion, to the point that it seemed to be manifesting its actual physical interior the last time we saw him physically cast it. And his creativity as a sorcerer had spiked significantly, him being able to take out characters that were at least grade 1 and many times potentially special grade. So he was a character who was primed to keep up with Yuji, and be one of the top heroes in this story. The downside is that is gone now. Because whatever happens with this, that progress has been pretty much erased due to his actual current standing, which is that Riemann Sukuna took over Megumi's body and has corrupted his techniques. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that I don't think some of the new techniques haven't looked cool. Like, for example, the fact that Nue with Megumi looked like a fairly oversized owl that you could potentially ride, but really had a hard time flying around, to the fact that now it's the size of the top of a skyscraper and can summon a massive thunderstorm that hails artillery down on people. I do enjoy the upgrade. There's also some interesting distinctive differences, like the fact that Sukuna's, divine dogs are Dobermans instead of the almost wolf/husky style that Megumi has. That aside, though, his is interesting for the fact of if Megumi could have had these, he would have been an even stronger character, but it's not explained whether these are down to Sukuna's interpretation of the technique, which is possible. We know that your interpretation plays a large role in the use of a technique, or if it was due to how much cursed energy Sukuna was flooding into them, because we do know he had a substantially huge amount. I think that whichever way it slid, there would have been a potential for Megumi, but less so with the, cursed energy angle. Either way, though, his may look cool, and they definitely have some cool expanded abilities, but in large part what made them special is gone. Because Sukuna is not exactly the most creative fighter in the world. And part of the fun of the Ten Shadows was the way that Megumi could use them creatively to get around his problems and come out on top. In many ways, Yuji embodies the epitome of a physical fighter. Megumi embodied the epitome of a sorcerer who could interpret and be creative with his technique. Sukuna is not creative with a technique at all. As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny that he chose to crush up 3 of his summons to turn them into, a mutant form that supposedly was somewhat at least on par with Maharaga, but didn't end up doing jack to Gojo. So, he's not exactly the best at this. And that leads us to another problem. Sukuna has so liberally abused the Ten Shadows technique at this point, if Megumi got it back, it's unclear how that would have affected his technique. What summons does he still have access to? Could he use some of the new techniques that Sukuna figured out with it? And while we're at it, I will drop that side note. Sukuna did not suddenly get good with this technique. You have to remember that an incarnated sorcerer gets all the memories of the person they were incarnated into. So essentially, he kind of cheated. But fundamentally, Megumi's ability is very strong, and under Sukuna, it did get I wouldn't say got a massive boost. I would rather say that it became very plot convenient, because, as has been discussed on this channel and many others, Maharaga was basically the key to getting Gojo out of the story. It didn't need to be, but regardless of the fact of Gege unnecessarily removing Gojo, putting the audience through that, and kind of ruining a large portion of his own story, it happened, and we're just going to have to accept that that will have happened, and it's never getting fixed, and we're just going to deal with that at the end of the series. So what could Megumi have become? If his current state is so lopsided and unorganized and fairly just at the whims at this point without any consistent world building, what could he have been? I'll just say, I think that if Yuji was, like I mentioned before, the kind of the embodiment of the physical sorcerer, there's a very good chance that Megumi could have been his equal. I actually would have preferred it if all 3 of the main trio had embodied different aspects of Jujutsu. Like, I would have loved it if Nobara had gotten a maximum technique. I would have loved it if Yuji had the Black Flash and Megumi had his domain expansion, because those 3 are the height of Jujutsu, and it would have made some parallel sense. I would have also very much preferred to see Megumi fully unlock his domain expansion, though truth be told, while we don't know what it was, I'm sure we'll get to see under Sukuna, but I couldn't care less, I would have preferred it to be an open domain expansion, because the idea of him just pouring out a near limitless amount of Shadow Shikigami kind of would have been awesome. He would have been like an army unto himself, and it really would have made him, in a way, kind of like Suguru Geto, having that army of cursed spirits. He would have had an army of Shikigami. It could have even been something similar to Death Swarm, maybe, like for Dagon's technique. Aside from that, It would have been really cool to see him with like Round Deer, because we know that Round Deer is a utility item in terms of healing, but it can also be used to disrupt other sorcerers' attacks and abilities. It would have been cool to see what he could do with that. Direct Bowl is an offensive weapon. I could see him pairing it with like Rabbit Escape to form a shroud and then bulldoze over an enemy, and then maybe pop out of their shadow. There is also some aspect of what other things could he have done with shadows in general. We don't have any more progression on this from Sukuna because Sukuna has no interest in that. But, Megumi could sink into people's shadows. He could store things in his shadows. He could do a lot with them. Were there other things he could maybe do with them? Possibly. Could he also do things like alter the shapes of his Shikigami, even without having to merge them? What are some of the other, hidden well abilities? Could he merge, Divine Dog and Nue, for instance? Could he merge all these other ones together? And then lastly, if he unlocked all of them, like, could he combine all of them to somehow beat the Maharaga? Possibly. No one had ever tamed the Maharaga, and I think Megami accomplishing that would have been cool. I definitely think Megami with Maharaga would have been, on par with Yuji if Yuji unlocked Sukuna's technique, because I think that would have made the... And then, I feel like Straw Doll technique may have also had hidden applications that might have brought it up, at least partially, to those levels. So it would have been really cool to see the three of them kind of become the new special grades, and that was partially... could have happened in the beginning of this series, but at this point, I don't think that's going to happen. So, what he could have been was awesome, but a lot of things in Jujutsu Kaisen could have been awesome. So, I just think it's kind of cool for us to talk about that now, and just kind of see what other stuff Gay Game might throw in, but I think we all kind of got the establishment that with, like, Maharaga, for instance, its adaptation was cool when it was introduced. It became a scapegoat when it was used on Gojo. And I think the key difference there is that the adaptation originally had like cool mechanics to it. With Sukuna, it was just used to beat Gojo. And it didn't even make a lot of sense as to how that happened. So Megumi could have been a fantastically powerful character that would have been awesome to end this series with, going up against the bad guys. Now, he is just a forgotten character.